When it comes to villains in fantasy, a big current debate is whether to Dark Lord or to not Dark Lord your antagonist. In other words, whether the overly complex villain with some sympathetic traits isn't tired and purely evil, Dark Lords should make a comeback or not. But to me, the morality scale of your villain is the wrong aspect to focus on. There are many more aspects authors could be exploring to make your villain more impactful, whether they're redeemable or not. I want to dissect many different aspects of a well-written fantasy villain, using great examples as case studies. From Homelander in The Boys, to the Batman's Rogue Gallery, to Cersei Lannister in A Song of Ice and Fire, to Don Quixote do Flamingo in One Piece. Each of them has a specific aspect particularly honed to make their stories better.
So, today we're going to break down what truly makes a great villain in fantasy, and we're going to frame the discussion in a few different aspects. We're going to look at the aspects that make a villain stand out, the different villain archetypes, and the main elements you need to have to properly portray them, some common mistakes to avoid, and overall just discuss the aspects your villain need to have to be memorable. So let's get to it.
On a story's mechanics level, villains are obviously essential for many reasons. They bring conflict, raise the stakes, and act as a conduit to force the hero to make tough choices. Without a good villain, the story feels flat.
Great rule of thumb to writing villains, and to me, even a baseline of the role of the villain in the story, it's for them to act as a foil for what the hero represents. So yeah, your villain needs to be a threat, but they also should challenge everything the hero stands for, or maybe even represent a twisted reflection of the hero's core traits. This is the easiest way to achieve some thematic exploration in your story. It's by creating contrasts.
Batman is one of the best examples of this. His Rogue Gallery is probably the best collection of villains in any superhero lore, and is filled with villains that are, in one way or another, distorted mirror images of him. Each one highlights and contracts a different aspect of his personality, philosophy, or trauma, taken to an extreme. Let's start, obviously, with the Joker. He's the perfect antithesis to everything Batman stands for. Batman is a symbol of control, discipline, and justice. The Joker, he's chaos personified, thriving on unpredictability and destruction. The Joker wants to prove that order is an illusion, that deep down everyone is just one bad day away from madness. Every encounter between them, it's a clash of philosophies, with Gotham caught in the middle. Then you have Two-Face, who's arguably one of the most tragic reflections of Batman. He started as Harvey Dent, Gotham's White Knight, a crusader for justice, someone Batman believed could fix the city in ways he never could. But after his disfigurement, he becomes consumed by duality and chance, relying on a coin flip to make decisions. Batman's struggle with morality and vengeance, as well as his dual nature, because of his secret identity, is mirrored in Two-Face's every move. Scarecrow takes things in yet another direction. He represents fear, Batman's most powerful tool. But where Batman uses fear to protect the innocent and keep criminals in check, Scarecrow weaponizes it for cruelty and chaos. He wants to show people the dark corners of their own minds and make them suffer through their worst nightmares. Even Catwoman plays her part as a foil. She's not a traditional villain, she's more of a morally gray counterpart. Where Batman is rigid, bound by his code and driven by responsibility, Catwoman lives in the moment, doing what benefits her the most. She's a thief, sure, but she also brings out Batman's more human side, challenging his rules and tempting him to question what he really stands for.
I really like this Batman's Rogue Gallery example, because it really illustrates how your hero's personality and values can be challenged from many different points of view and aspects, because each Batman villain either contrasts or reflects one aspect of Batman's personality. Now compare this to poorly written villains and heroes, right? Where the hero's point of view isn't challenged at all throughout the story. And again, that's what makes villains so crucial. They define the framework of the story. They challenge the hero on every level, so it's physically, morally, and mentally. The best types of heroes and villains conflict is a battle of ideas. A question of who will break first, and who is ultimately right in the grand scheme of things. That's the kind of villain that readers remember.
Now, I think it would be worth it to go over some villain archetypes we often find in fantasy and aspects you need to consider in order to nail them. Starting with the Dark Lord, which is the classic ultimate evil, the villain who wants to destroy or dominate the world, often tied to ancient and cosmic forces. Think Sauron from The Lord of the Rings, a literal embodiment of corruption and power. These villains thrive on scale. They're a threat to the protagonist, but also to entire worlds.
So this is my chance to address the Dark Lord discourse. My problem with the Dark Lord archetype is not the completely evil character equals bad characterization. I get that people may be tired of morally complex villains and just want some deliciously evil character to hate. That's fine. My problem is when your mustache twirling evil Dark Lord doesn't represent anything and you're not making any point with their inclusion in the story. If your story is about finding hope amidst chaos and destruction, your Dark Lord can embody this chaos and destruction the hero is trying to avoid. Hell, maybe the hero is even gonna succumb to it. My point is, your simplistic Dark Lord can still mean something to the story, even if they're simplistic.
Another one is the fallen hero, one of the most powerful villain archetypes because of how personal it feels. These are characters who once fought for good but fell into darkness, often due to ambition, betrayal, or a personal tragedy they couldn't overcome. They are also a powerful representation of what the protagonist can become if they make the wrong decisions and take the wrong lessons out of life. An excellent example of a fallen hero arc for a villain is Daenerys from Game of Thrones. Daenerys starts her journey as an inspiring leader, freeing slaves and vowing to build a better world. For most of the series, she's portrayed as a liberator, with her growing power symbolizing hope and strength. However, as her power increases, so does her ruthlessness. After suffering personal losses and feeling betrayed, she becomes increasingly paranoid and obsessed with destiny. Her fall culminates in her devastating decision to burn King's Landing, killing thousands of innocents in pursuit of absolute control.
So Daenerys' arc serves as a tragic warning about the corrupting nature of power and how good intentions can twist into tyranny when unchecked. She becomes a dark reflection of Jon Snow, who, unlike Daenerys, chooses sacrifice and humility over power. Her descent into villainy is heartbreaking because it feels inevitable, showing how even the most heroic figures like her, throughout most of the story, can morally fall if they're consumed by ambition and loss. It's a pity this wasn't that well executed in the TV show though.
Tragic villains are some of the most emotionally resonant. They're driven by loss, injustice, or trauma, making their motivations understandable, even if their actions are unforgivable. Magneto from X-Men is a prime example, a Holocaust survivor who fights for mutant rights but becomes increasingly militant and dangerous. We sympathize with his pain, even when he crosses the line into villainy. Audiences should feel empathy for them, but not to the point that their actions are justified. Make them complex, but never let them stop being a threat. Corrupt authority figures thrive on power and control, turning their position of influence into a tool for oppression. These villains are perfect for exploring themes of tyranny, freedom, and corruption. There's Dolores Umbridge from Harry Potter, who embodies the banality of evil. Behind her sugary smile and pink cardigans is a zealot obsessed with order and control, enforcing cruel punishments under the guise of discipline and the greater good. These characters are terrifying because they believe they are right, making their actions feel disturbingly justified in their own mind. This archetype works best when the villain's ideology is clear and their downfall, often at the hands of those they oppressed, becomes an immensely satisfying payoff. Finally, let's talk about the monster, because sometimes the best villains aren't human at all. The monster archetype represents primal fear and the unknown, something inhuman, often unstoppable and beyond reason. Think of Cthulhu. From H.P. Lovecraft's stories, these villains don't need deep motivations. Their power lies in their mystery and the existential dread they inspire. Keep them shrouded in shadow and let the fear of the unknown do the heavy lift. Even though monsters aren't complex characters with layered backstories, they can act as allegories for real-world threats, giving their presence greater thematic weight. Again, the White Walkers from Game of Thrones are a perfect example. While they rarely speak and have no personal motivation beyond bringing death and destruction, they serve as a clear allegory for climate change. Just like climate change, the White Walkers are slow, relentless, and inevitable, only becoming unstoppable because of political infighting and humanity's failure to act in time. Sometimes the villain fits more than one of these categories. Think of Homelander from The Boys. He is a mix of corrupt authority, the fallen hero, and the monster. His need to be adored drives his every move, but when the world doesn't give him what he craves, he lashes out in cruelty and violence. He represents the corrupting nature of unchecked power, but he's also a tragic product of manipulation and a loveless upbringing. Homelander constantly walks the line between being pitiful and monstrous, which keeps the audience on edge because you never know if he'll offer a smile or obliterate an entire crowd. This combination of overwhelming power, psychological fragility, and moral emptiness makes him one of the most compelling and memorable villains in modern media.
So, these are some of the most common villain archetypes you'll find in fantasy. The Dark Lord, the embodiment of chaos and destruction. The fallen hero represents everything that protagonists could become if they make the wrong choices. The tragic villain, driven by pain and injustice. The corrupt authority, using their power to control and oppress. And finally, the monster, a force of nature that taps into primal fears of the unknown. Sometimes a great villain can even blend multiple archetypes, like the Homelander example. The key is understanding what role your villain plays in the story and using their archetype to highlight your themes and challenge your hero in the most meaningful way possible.
One-dimensional villains are the common pitfall in fantasy. These are the purely evil bad guys with no real motivation, personality, or complexity beyond wanting to cause destruction. Complex villains are better than oversimplified ones, but as I mentioned, if you want a simple-minded villain, at least make sure it serves for thematic exploration somehow. Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones. She's a deeply multifaceted character driven by a blend of love, trauma, and ruthless ambition. Full of contradiction. Her love for her children defines much of what she does. She's ruthless, calculating, and willing to burn the world to ashes if it means keeping them safe. Beauty to Cersei is a weapon, and she's keenly aware of how it gives her power in a male-dominated world. But as she ages and feels that power slipping away, her paranoia grows, especially toward younger women like Marguerite Tyrell, whom she sees as a threat to her status and legacy. Her relationship with Jaime is another deeply psychological layer to her character. On the surface, it's a forbidden romance, but beneath that lies something darker. A toxic codependency rooted in the fact that Jaime is the only person she feels truly sees and accepts her for who she is. These facets, her obsessive love, use of beauty as power, deep-seated paranoia, and toxic relationships, turn Cersei into something far more interesting than a typical villain. She's a tragic figure trapped in her own insecurities and ambitions, making her both monstrous and deeply human. Not every villain needs a redemption arc. In modern storytelling, it's become almost expected that every bad guy will turn out to be misunderstood or end up switching sides. Choose carefully when giving a villain redemption. Sometimes the best villains are the ones who never change. There's something to be said for a story ending with the villain doubling down on their misguided beliefs and tragically paying the price for their choices. Don Quixote do Flamingo is a perfect example of a villain who doesn't need or deserve a redemption arc. His refusal to change and his unwavering belief in his twisted worldview make him even more compelling. Despite his tragic past, Do Flamingo fully embraces his role as a tyrant and manipulator, but the story never tries to excuse his actions. This lack of redemption makes his downfall all the more satisfying and reinforces the core theme of One Piece, that power without empathy will always lead to ruin. A great villain should always feel like they're lurking in the background even when they're off-screen. This can be achieved through henchmen, propaganda, or symbols that remind the audience of their power and influence. In Harry Potter, Voldemort rarely appears in person early on, but his presence is constantly felt through his followers, the fear he inspires, and the impact of his past actions.
To summarize, those are common mistakes you can avoid while writing villains. So avoid one-dimensional villains with no depth or at least thematic purpose. Don't overdo it with redemption arcs that feel forced and unnecessary. Avoid the stereotypical motivations that lack personal connection. And make sure your villain's presence is still felt even when they're off-screen. A well-written villain should feel real, with motivations that resonate and a presence that lingers. If you want to go for the Dark Lord approach, make sure that it is at least saying something about your themes. Whether your villains are layered and complex like Cersei, or they are utterly irredeemable like Doflamingo, or just lurking like a constant threat in the background, the best villains elevate the story and leave a lasting impression. So try your best to nail these aspects, and you're gonna ace the villain assignment in your story.
At the end of the day, a great villain usually fulfills a few different roles: an obstacle for the hero, the driving force that gives your story depth and meaning, a foil to what the hero represents, or a cautionary tale to what would happen if the hero made the wrong choices. So don't just throw in a bad guy for the sake of conflict. Make your villain personal, make them meaningful, your story will be unforgettable.
And that's it for the video today. Feel free to mention in the comments if I forgot any archetypes, and just how you see this whole discussion about villains in general. We also have a free Discord server for fantasy and world building discussion. You can find the link in the channel's page. Hope to see you there, and see you next time.
Come join our Tavern discussion of fantasy storytelling and world building here at Loregeist. Give it a thumbs up, thanks for watching, and may your tales be ever epic.